Hi, class. I hope that you guys can hear me okay. I am presenting for week 7 on poverty and its impact on families. So, the issue that I decided to talk about for this presentation is the issue of poverty in families and some of the impacts that poverty has on families. Um, Poverty is a social problem. Many children and families are affected by living in poverty, which ultimately affects the way the family systems function. It's a huge issue in the United States. It's a huge issue worldwide, but the focus is more on poverty in the United States. There are many children and families that are living in poverty, and millions of children and families that are living below the poverty line. Poverty is described as according to Wood 2003, poverty is described as an economic state that does not allow for the provisions of basic family and child needs, such as adequate food, clothing, housing, just basic necessities. So with poverty, that obviously is going to affect the development and health of children and affects growth. Um, Going over to the next slide. Um, Poverty is defined as lacking the usual or socially acceptable amount of money or material possessions. Again, according to Wood 2003, poverty is described as a sociocultural and environmental dimension as a condition of misery and hopelessness and dependency. As I mentioned earlier, many children and families are living in poverty, and many children and families are living below the poverty line. A poverty line, poverty limit, or poverty threshold is the minimum level of income deemed necessary for a country, and that poverty threshold or poverty limit is set by the United States government. The poverty threshold is used to indicate the least amount of income that a person or a family needs in order to meet their basic needs. Individuals are considered poor if the income falls below a specified amount. It's really difficult to describe what the poverty threshold is because it varies. It varies on the size of the family unit. It varies on families with children, if they have one child, two, multiple children household. It varies by elderly. So it's very hard to have like an all-around baseline of poverty threshold because it's just going to vary on the family unit. So it's difficult to provide those values, but they can be searched and viewed through the U.S. Census Bureau or the Research Institute on Poverty and other various government websites. According to the National Center for Children in Poverty 2012, and this is back in 2012, so it's not as recent, but their definition of economic hardship under extreme poverty, less than 50% of the federal poverty level is considered extreme poverty. Poverty is going to be less than 100% of the federal poverty level, and low income is going to be less than 200 of the federal poverty level. So poverty is defined, again, as the economic state doesn't allow for provisions of the basic family and child needs. So you can't meet your requirements for food, clothing, housing, just overall basic needs being met. Income poverty is a condition of not having enough income to meet those basic necessities. And sadly, children in families with children are the most affected and the most at risk since children are dependent on others, their parents, their adult caretakers, to be able to provide for them financially. So they are most affected because children are relying on the adults to provide for them. Moving on to the next slide. Poverty and families, and I have to go back to what our the guidelines are here so I can make sure I'm staying on track. So this is still the introduction to the issue of poverty. Um, Poverty for children and families is a concern in America. In recent years, 1 in 5 American children, so 12 to 14 million, have lived in families in which income has failed to exceed the poverty threshold. So 1/5 of American children have lived in families whose incomes were no more than twice the poverty threshold. That's according to Duncan, Brooks, and Gunn, 1997. According to Robbins, Stagman, and Smith in 2012, there are almost 24 million children under the age of 6 in the United States. Oops, and I see there's a typo there, United States, and large numbers of young children growing up in families who experience economic hardships. So there are almost half, 11.4 million children that live in low income or poor families. That's nearly 3 million children and families that are living in extreme poverty. So as a result of poverty, the family is affected in many areas. If we can't meet the basic needs of food and shelter, clothes, heat, electricity, all of that is going to affect the growth and development, educational needs, medical needs, and just an array of factors that are associated with living in poverty. There are other definitions of what poverty is described by Wood. It's families lacking money, material possessions like basic needs of clothes and vehicles. Wood describes poverty as the dimension of conditions of misery. Environmental dimensions as a condition of misery, dependency, and hopelessness. When thinking about large families, and what I mean is that it's families with single parent households and multiple children, or even two parent households and multiple children, they're living in poverty because there's just multiple children and families in that household, and that could be viewed as a condition of misery, feeling hopeless, being dependent on public assistance, yet still receiving that help and being below the poverty threshold. Going back to, I think I skipped a slide and I went a little too fast. I apologize. So going back to this slide, for the National Center for Children in Poverty of 2012, the National Center for Children in Poverty defines poverty as the economic hardships. And again, the 3 levels are the extreme poverty, which is less than 50% of the federal poverty level, poverty which is less than 100% of the federal poverty level, and then the low income level, which is less than 200% of the poverty level. So again, these levels or thresholds are going to vary based on the age, income, family, household, etc. But for example, I didn't include this in here because there's just a lot of data from the Center for Children in Poverty regarding statistics and just a lot of information about poverty levels for families. But for example, in 2016, and this is coming from the National Center for Children in Poverty, the federal poverty threshold for a family of 4 with 2 children is an income limit of $24,339. A family of 4 with children has to be at this income limit to be considered poor, but in reality, actual family expenses vary greatly. In order to make just basic ends meet, a family of 4 with 2 children should be at an income limit of $48,678 a year just to be able to meet those basic needs. So that's double the amount of what a family actually makes. So when we look at children and families where parents are either single parent households or 2 parent households, or employed with minimum wage jobs, or parents taking on 2 or 3 minimum wage jobs, or 1 adult working, we can see that the issue of poverty is a real concern. There is a lot of people are really living in poverty if it's based off of this threshold that the government sets for us. So we can see that the poverty level income is not enough to support a family. The National Center for Children in Poverty and research suggests that on average, a family needs an income equal to about 2 times more than the federal poverty threshold in order just to meet our basic needs. And again, this is coming from the National Center for Children in Poverty. Like I said, there was just a lot of details on this, on the data for this. So this is the slide that I skipped a little bit too quickly on. So as I mentioned before, millions of children and families are affected by poverty in the United States. Duncan and Brooks Gunn, which showed back in 1997, showed numbers of 12 to 14 million American families that are living at the poverty threshold. And in 2012, that amount had doubled to 24 million American families that are living at the poverty threshold. In 2012, that amount had doubled to 24 million with families that have children under the age of 6. The most recent information was in 2017, which was obtained from the United States Census Bureau, showing that 40 million people are living in poverty. So again, the figures are doubling for poverty levels in the United States, it appears. The United States Census Bureau has a 40-page report on poverty in the U.S. for 2017, and looking at those numbers, poverty has doubled recently, and it just seems to be a growing concern. I'm running out of time, and I still have a lot to discuss, so it's going to cut out here in just a little bit, and I'll have to continue. So the next section that I was going to talk about is just, well, here's the economic hardships, and this is based again off the National Center for Children in Poverty. We can see that children under the age of 6 in families, children under age 6 in families experience economic hardships. This is based in 2010, so these numbers are a lot higher now. We can see that extreme poverty is right here, this brownish one. So 12% of the population back in 2010 was living in extreme poverty. These are above lower income, so 52% of families with children under the age of 6 were above the low income threshold. 13% were living in poverty, and then low income was 23%. So back in 2010, it's obviously still concerning, but now, several years later, this number has doubled. So I'm going to stop right here, and then I'll continue on to the next section, which will discuss the risk factors of poverty.